Folks, I gotta tell you something. I love slavery. Absolutely love slavery and indentured servitude. Come on now, admit it. You love slavery and indentured servitude too. Because without slavery and indentured servitude, none of us would be here in America. And let's face it, if we brought back slavery and indentured servitude, that would keep a lot of people in check, right? I'm just kidding, everybody. I'm just kidding. This is the Cultural Confederacy. Welcome back to the channel. It's Thursday. Hope you're all having a great week, getting geared up for the weekend. And in honor of Juneteenth, June 19th, I thought I'd share with you 19 slave laws from the Georgia slave laws, 1755 to 1860. Now, I know I just tripped you up there at the beginning of the video, but let me say from the onset, I'm really glad we no longer have slavery or indentured servitude, because my Irish ancestors came over to this country by indentured servitude. In a lot of ways, indentured servitude was like slavery because indentured servants could be bought, sold, traded, or inherited. Oftentimes, they had these 7 or 10-year terms, contracts that were extended without their knowledge. The work was very brutal. And they worked long hours, just like slaves did. Good 12, 14, 15, 16 hours a day. And I got to share this with you. I was debating with somebody last night here on YouTube about slavery and what was going on in Europe in the 1850s, early 1860s, with child labor, with the factories at that time, industrialization. And they want to say that I was a racist or I was a bigot. Little do they know that my cousins are Japanese American and that my uncle's daughter-in-law is black. So being somebody who's actually studied this, I can tell you that conditions for anybody living in the 19th century were not the best. I mean, picture it. You have a free black person living in the same area as a white family that had no running water. That is what life was like back then. Talked about this in my last video. If you lived on the high plains, most likely you were going to face cholera or some other type of disease. But we need to clear the air about a few things. Oh yeah, and I wrote back to this guy. This is my last comment to him. He was telling me, well, you can't equate slavery to poverty. Well, yes, I can, because people can be a slave to poverty. They can work just as many hours as a slave did to get themselves out of poverty, right? And in the 1800s, you had these unions that took advantage of workers for political power. But let's talk about, or clear the air here, with the 1619 Project and 1776 Project, 13th Amendment, this whole date of June 19th. Because the truth is about June 19th, that isn't the official day that slavery ended in this country. The 13th Amendment was passed on January 31st, 1865, and it wasn't ratified until December of that year. So it went through the House of Representatives January 31st. Took about a year for them to ratify it. Finally ratified it December 6, 1865. June 19th is a date that officials went down to Galveston, Texas, and announced that slaves were now free. But in 1867, you had over 400 slaves living in Santa Fe. And even though the 13th Amendment did away with slavery, it allowed for slave labor in the case of criminal punishment. A lot of states took advantage of this. Something else I mentioned on my last video. So when did slavery officially end? So you could really say that it was December 6th, 1865. But in many ways, it's never really left us, because you still have pockets of slavery all over the world, i.e. the Sudan. The most common form of slavery today is debt slavery. And the 1619 Project. Now, this whole fight between the 1619 group and the 1776ers, this is basically a political fight between Democrats and Republicans. That's what it is. Let's be honest, that's exactly what it is. A fight between Democrats and Republicans. It's a power grab for who wants to control the narrative. Now, the 1619 Project, they're right in some ways. The 1776 Project, they're right in other ways. And it is true that in 1619, there was an English ship that came over here with African slaves. But you have to go back a century earlier, actually to the 1490s, early 1500s. If you go to 1508, Ponce de Leon established the Spanish settlement of Puerto Rico, and he used the native Llanos tribe, I believe that's how you pronounce it, for labor. But because of the diseases that the Spanish and even the Portuguese brought over, this tribe eventually died out because of the diseases and overwork. Now in 1513, this is when you can really pinpoint the first wave of slaves coming to the Americas, North America, South America, and in some ways Central America. 1513 to about the 1860s. But indentured servitude did not end in the Americas until 1917. 1900, 1901, Hawaii passed the Organic Act, which abolished indentured servitude in that state or that territory. It wasn't a state quite yet. But between 1670 to 1715, slavery spread to present-day Georgia, Tennessee, North Carolina, South Carolina, Florida, and Alabama. And you had 24,000 to 51,000 Native Americans that were enslaved. So it was Native Americans who made up the large percentage of slaves in the South, not African slaves. It's true, 100% true. Now, let's talk about these Georgia slave laws, 1755 to 1860, because there are a lot of questions. Were slave owners able to get away with whatever they wanted with these slaves? Were slaves mistreated? Did they have certain rights? Could they buy their freedom? Was Northern law the same as Southern law? There's a very interesting case out of Florida from 1860. This is on the eve of the Civil War. It's Cantor the slave, or the Cantor the slave in error versus the state of Florida. He was accused of a crime. I believe it was possibly rape or murder. But the judge, get this, the judge said that he would be treated the same as any white person who was tried for the same offense. This is 1860 in the South, in Florida. Eve of the Civil War. Now, the Georgia slave laws identify, once again, 1755 to 1860, identify slaves as follows. As follows, ladies and gentlemen, as follows. Okay, so I'm having fun here, can't you tell? So, they identify them as the following. Quote, all Negroes, Indians, mulattoes, or mestizos, that's somebody of Native American and Spanish origin, shall hereafter, except those already free, shall hereafter be in this province, and their issue or offspring born or to be born are hereby declared to be and remain forever after absolute slaves. This follows the legal condition of the mother, not the father. This is deemed in law personal chattel, but a slave could sue for freedom. Now, legal responsibility for the enslaved persons includes master owner, persons, quote-unquote, having charge or government of slaves. So that's your overseer, white family member, white employer. And I'm not going to do these, I'm just giving you a precursor here to the actual slave laws that are in here. So I'm just going to go all over the place. I'll start with number 1. Colonial law for abuse of slaves, white offenders, included fines, whippings, or corporal punishment, imprisonment, starting in 1817 with the introduction of jails. In law, this is, quote, a person, or a person in law is considered a white person, or it could be a white immigrant. Just going through my list here, like I said, these aren't in any particular order. Any white person could apprehend and moderately correct a slave without a ticket or pass, so slaves had to have a ticket or a pass to leave the plantation or to travel. They had to wear badges. And any white person who forged a ticket for another person's slave or property could be fined, although the word, quote-unquote, is actually used in the law. No more than 7 men slaves could travel high roads together unaccompanied by a white person. Every owner of a plantation with 25 slaves over the age of 16 must retain 1 white man capable of bearing arms. There was a 5-pound fine if you did not do so. That equates out to about $6.98 in American money. Given for inflation, today that would be $100, and I believe they paid that per month. They'd have a per-month fine. So a 5-pound fine, it's roughly about $7, and that turns out to be about $100 per month in today's money. In 1823, this was modified to include 10 or more slaves over the age of 16 must keep a white man capable of bearing arms as an overseer, manager, or superintendent, but the same fine applied. Now this is really important here. This is Article 4, Section 12 of the Georgia State Constitution. It talks about anybody who maliciously harms a slave, causes the death of a slave, etc., etc. So they shall suffer the same punishment as would be inflicted in case the like offender had been committed on a free white person. Once again, free white person could be a white person or a white immigrant. Goes on to say, and on the like proof, except in case of insurrection by such slave, and unless such death should happen by accident, and giving such slave moderate correction. Now, I've put down here number 19. I'm just going to read this to you now. These are two separate laws, but they are connected to each other. Unlawful for a white person to buy, sell, trade, barter, etc. for any goods or commodities from a slave. Slaves are not allowed to keep boat or canoe or raise horses or cattle. Owners or persons in charge of slaves living within a town's limits can give slaves a license to sell goods, etc., etc. Just trying to see if there's anything I missed here. Going through my notes once again. Okay, cruel treatment of slaves included excessive beating or whipping, withholding food or clothing, overworking, etc., etc. It says here, no person of color, free or slave, shall be allowed to preach or join in any religious exercise with any person of color, free or slave, where more than 7 persons of color are present. Of course, slaves could not go alone out of town, off the plantation, without, like I said before, a white person or with a letter or ticket signed by the master or person in charge. Any white person could apprehend or moderately correct a slave without a ticket or a pass. And they talk, too, in here about these gatherings where you have strange slaves. I don't know what that means, but now, it was also against the law, too. This is also in here. If you harbored a slave, a runaway slave that was accused of a crime, and you were doing that so the slave could avoid trial, you could be severely fined for that. And I believe that was a 200-pound fine, which in today's money would equate to about $12,000 or so. So, yes, there were certain, I don't want to say guardrails, but certain laws in place that did protect slaves, as you can see here. And once again, I'm not defending the institution of slavery or indentured servitude. I'm glad we no longer have those practices, but slavery does still exist in places like the Sudan, like I said. So I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please click that like button, subscribe, hit me up on Instagram at #JasonComposes, leave comments below. You can also reach me at Twitter, Cultural Confederacy at Twitter. Hope you all have a great rest of your week, great weekend. I'll catch you next time. Stay safe, everybody, and God bless this great country. Peace out.